Welcome to the Explainer. Today, we're tackling a question that honestly splits the entire field of economics right down the middle. It's a debate that shapes everything from the interest rates on your mortgage to how governments react when the economy goes haywire. So, let's get right into it. Is money just, a simple tool that helps us trade stuff, a kind of veil that just sits on top of the real economy? Or is it something much more powerful? Is it the actual engine that drives production, creates jobs, and determines who gets what? So here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll frame this big debate. Then we'll dive into each of the two major camps. We'll even look at a fascinating argument within one of those camps. And finally, we'll connect all this theory to the real-world decisions that affect every single one of us. Now, it was the great economist Joseph Schumpeter who really put a name to this fundamental divide. He identified two completely different ways of looking at the world, what he called real analysis and monetary analysis. All right, first up, let's talk about the reigning champion of mainstream economics, real analysis. For the better part of a century, this has been the go-to way of thinking for most policymakers and academics. At its heart, the idea here is pretty simple. If you want to know how an economy is really doing in the long run, you've got to look past the money and focus on the real stuff. How good is our technology? What resources do we have? What do people actually want to buy? In this world, money just helps things run a bit more smoothly. And that's where this idea of a veil comes from. Money just covers up what's really happening underneath, which is basically a massive system of barter, right? I trade my work for money, but I don't want the paper itself. I want it so I can trade it for food, for rent. Money just makes all that trading easier. It doesn't really change the basic equation. And listen, this isn't some fringe theory we're talking about. This is the bedrock of most of the big economic ideas you hear about, from the classical economists of the 19th century all the way up to the complex models that central banks use today. The core assumption is basically the same. In the long run, the real stuff is all that matters. So the crucial takeaway from this whole perspective is the idea of neutrality. The theory is that, a government printing a bunch of money might cause some short-term ripples, maybe a little inflation, but eventually it all just washes out. The economy finds its way back to its natural state. In the end, money is neutral. But what if that entire way of thinking is just wrong? Well, that brings us to the other side of this great divide, the world of monetary analysis. Yeah, this school of thought just throws that whole idea of a passive veil right out the window. It argues that money and finance are anything but neutral. They are active, powerful forces that directly shape how we invest, how wealth is distributed, and how our economy grows, not just today, but for the long haul. So, in this view, money isn't a veil at all. It's the engine. You see, in a capitalist economy, or an entrepreneur economy, as John Maynard Keynes called it, the whole point isn't just to trade things. The game is to start with money and end up with more money. That changes, everything. And this quote, it's just perfect. It was used by both Karl Marx and Keynes, which tells you how central this idea is. The veil view, CMC, means you sell a commodity for money to buy another commodity. Simple trade. But the engine view, MCM, says the real process is starting with money, turning it into a commodity, and then selling it to get more money back. The goal is pure accumulation. Okay, so this table really puts the two head to head. You see the conflict right there. Real analysis is built on the idea that if you make stuff, people will buy it. Supply creates its own demand. Monetary analysis flips that completely on its head and says, no, it's spending, demand, often fueled by credit, that determines what gets produced. But, okay, saying money is the engine, that's one thing. The really fascinating question is, how does that engine actually work? And that's where we find a really interesting debate inside the monetary analysis camp itself, especially around how money shapes the distribution of income and the accumulation of capital. Let's zoom in on something we hear about all the time, the interest rate set by the central bank. When that rate goes up or down, what actually happens on the ground? Specifically, how does that decision trickle down to affect the split between what workers earn in wages and what business owners make in profits? And this is where things get really interesting, because we get two very different answers. For post-Keynesian economists, when the interest rate goes up, it acts like a hurdle that all other profits have to clear, which can end up squeezing workers' wages. But for Marxian economists, it's different. They argue that interest rate doesn't change the total size of the profit pie. It just changes how that pie gets sliced up between the business owners making the goods and the bankers lending the money. Now, I know this can all seem a little abstract, a little academic, but trust me, which side you fall on here, Veil or Engine, has huge real-world consequences. It fundamentally changes how we think about solving our biggest economic problems. Think about it. If you believe money is just a veil, then a financial crisis is just a temporary hiccup, and a central bank's main job is just to keep prices stable. But if you think money is the engine, well then, a financial crisis can cause permanent damage to the real economy. Interest rate policy becomes a powerful and dangerous tool for shaping who gets what. Every single point on this slide changes depending on your starting assumption. And that brings us right back to the central question. When you look at the world we live in today, with all its challenges, which story makes more sense to you? Is money the simple, neutral veil? Or is it the powerful engine driving the whole machine? That's the real challenge this great economic divide leaves us with.